Hitting record now. And we should be recording. Just want to make sure. Yep, we're good. Okay, cool. All right, welcome to this afternoon's digital lunch and learn on prerequisite approvals. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.
All right. All right, prerequisite approvals. How to understand if they are required and how to conduct the research to figure it out. Prerequisite approvals can be a pain in the butt and a little bit confusing, as you guys have figured out by now, but hopefully this will help a little bit. So the definition of success is for you guys to understand what a prerequisite approval is and how to determine if one is needed for a project. Is there anything that would make this workshop about pre-approvals successful for you that I don't know about already?
Yeah, just knowing what to research and like when prerequisites will be needed for certain types of projects. So yeah, we're clearly communicating, or more importantly, we're doing the research properly so we can communicate to the client what's needed.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll cover that and then we'll talk about it and make sure it's understood. All right. First, you guys at this point know this, but just to go over it again, a prerequisite approval is when an approval by multiple or one city governing departments are required prior to a permit being submitted to license and inspection. So some permits, you can just immediately go down to license and inspection, submit the permit and get approved. And then some permits, you would get a kickback, you get a request for information saying, hey, this needs to be approved by the streets department or by whoever. So that's what a prerequisite approval is. Not all projects need it, but some do. And that's the whole point of this. We're going to figure out which projects need it. So there are a lot of different city departments, and these are most of the ones we'll be dealing with. So of course, there's the Zoning Board of Adjustment. There's the Historical Commission, the City Planning Commission, and the Art Commission. The historical, city planning, and art are all within the same office, and they all work with each other very closely. Whereas that's why they're on the same line here. They're on the same column, whereas there's not as much cross collaboration between the departments going horizontally. And then, of course, there's the Office of Property Assessments, the Department of Records, and then the Streets Department. And then there's utility reviews, which we don't deal with, but that would be like the Water Department. So really, really big new construction projects are tearing up the road, so they have to get a Water Department review, PGW, PICO, stuff like that. We don't really deal with it, but it's still good to know that that's a part of it. Okay. So we're not going to go too much into the Zoning Board of Adjustment since we're moving away from zoning, and it's not really a pre-approval. It's kind of its own project, but we'll go over it briefly. So, of course, Zoning Board of Adjustment is required whenever there's a zoning permit application that is not going to be approved by licenses and inspections by right, which results in a variance being required to appeal the refusal, and the ZBA governs and oversees all zoning appeals and either approves or denies those appeals. And then, of course, there's a process to conducting research for potential ZBA involvement. I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole workshop in itself, but we do have a step-by-step blog post that provides an in-depth analysis of how to verify zoning. But generally, you would, on a basic level, you would go to Atlas, identify the basic zoning classification, and compare it to what the client is seeking. So the base zoning is RSA 5, and the client is seeking a multifamily, you know right then and there that a variance is required. But of course, it's extremely nuanced, and there's always like specific research that needs to be conducted, and that can be found in this blog post. We're not going to go into that today. But do you have any general questions about that?
Yeah.
All right, so let's move into the main pre-approval. So the first one is we have the Historical Commission, which there's a list of properties in Philadelphia that have been deemed historic, and there's also a list of neighborhoods that are historic, or there's boundaries within those neighborhoods that are deemed historic. So anytime a property falls within a historic district so it's not one or the other, and it's on the historic register, then the historic commission is going to have to review the project plans and approve them before we go and apply for a permit. So just to reiterate that, a property address might be on the list of historic places, or it may not be, but it might be within a boundary of a historic district neighborhood requiring historic approval. So, of course, Old City is an example of a neighborhood that has many historic designations and properties. So anything in Old City should trigger, like, yeah, it's likely going to need historical commission approval. And then here's some steps to research if historical commission is required. The first one is easy enough. You can just search for the address on the list of historic properties. And there's two lists. There's one with the OPA compliant addresses. And an OPA compliant address is a city approved and documented address. But of course, some properties, the Google My Business or the mailing address is not the OPA address. It's just like the address they put out to the world. Somehow they're different, but that happens. So there's two lists, the OPA address list and then there's an approximate address list. So you could check both of these to see if it falls on those lists. And then you can also check the historic district neighborhoods to see if a property falls within any of them. So I'm just going to click on these real quick so we can look at them. So the first step would be to check this website or this list that they have. It's a PDF, just Command F and then search the address. That's the OPA compliant addresses. This is the unofficial address, Command F, and just search it here. And then these are all the neighborhoods. We don't work in a lot of these, but these are the neighborhoods that have historic districts or historic designations. I wouldn't go crazy with looking, because this is a lot of information. I would just search the register for the address. If you don't see it, but it's in a historic district neighborhood, just reach out to the City Planning Commission directly and ask them. Because when all else fails, just use your contacts and ask. Okay. So yeah, if you're unsure, reach out to the Historical Commission to ask them if their approval will be required, or via our contacts or their general contact information. So do you have any questions about historical? No?
No.
So then there's City Planning Commission. Like I said, that's also a part of historical, city planning, and art are all within the same area, and they oversee kind of the similar things. But anyway, so the City Planning Commission, their whole purpose is to guide the orderly growth and development of Philly. And then there's multiple of different review types that the CPC governs. The biggest one, and the one that you guys went to the meeting for, was civic design reviews, which are for very, very large projects that will alter the city in big ways. So the CPC needs to weigh in on these. And then the one we will deal with is site plan reviews, which are required for some zoning permits, such as lot line relocations, parking lots, landscaping, and street front for corner properties. So if there's ever a corner property that's being subdivided or consolidated, the City Planning Commission will tell us which is the street frontage determination. And then facade reviews, of course, are required along certain streets in Center City to ensure the external building changes are in alignment with the pedestrian experience that the city is trying to create. And the facade represents anything related to the building on the outside. So if there's painting, window sizes are changing, signs are going up, things like that, like bricks are being relaid, all that kind of stuff requires City Planning Commission facade review approval. So how to research if CPC approval is required. First, of course, identify the project type. And then if it's a lot line relocation or a facade in Center City on either Broad Street, Market Street, Chestnut Street, or Walnut Street, then CPC approval is 100% going to be required before we submit the permit. And then you can visit the CPC plan review types webpage and identify if the project falls into any of these categories. So you could see how they break it down. There's civic design review, facade review, a garage facade review, which we'll likely never do. They do public open spaces, sometimes when neighborhoods have certain design standards, and then a site plan review. So like I said, we'll usually be dealing with facade or site plan review. So you can always go and just conduct some more research there. And then of course, if you're unsure, just like with any other ones, reach out to our contacts and ask them, or reach out to planning@phila.gov. Now just to sidestep, we have 2 lot line relocation projects right now that, yes, they will need City Planning Commission to review the survey and approve it before we go and apply. So, any questions about City Planning Commission? All right, and then Art Commission approval.
Wait.
The lots that we do have though aren't in any of those streets for subdivision. Broad Market, Chestnut.
So yeah, so that I should have reworded it. Lot line relocation at all, and then a facade on those streets.
All lot line relocations?
Yeah.
CPC approval is what you're saying?
Okay, I didn't know that, and that's before we submit a permit. So
Yeah.
Steve, without CPC, we submitted the permit and got additional information. Do you remember we have Jen on it?
Yeah.
With 10, or not 10, I'm sorry.
Yep, we should reach out to Randall or whoever our CPC contact is, and just like, because this is something that is very hazy with them, because it is required, but they might not have said it on the RFI letter because it's a variance anyway, and they're like, it doesn't even matter at this point, it's a variance. Say we go through the variance process, resubmit, they could issue another RFI letter at that point saying, hey, you got to go get City Planning Commission. So I would just like reach out to our contact at CPC and be like, hey, you say that all lot line relocations are required for your approval. Is that true or not? Because it is, but it's, it generally is. But this was a variance anyway, so it would have been a waste of a trip. Anyway, so that's if any lot line relocation, and then facades on those streets.
Okay.
Why have you think about Allbirds? And then the Church of Scientology. Okay, so that's city planning. And then Art Commission, they oversee, it's a little more straightforward, of course, they oversee and approve any designs and certain projects in certain locations in the city. So for us, it's whenever we work on a sign or a canopy or an awning or any artwork that's projecting over the public right away. And then other stuff we don't really need to deal with, but I put it there. So any construction projects on city-owned property are funded with city money. They have to approve, but in our jurisdiction, it's always usually for a signage project. And then how to research if Art Commission approval is required. So unlike the CPC and Historical Commission, there's not as many clear qualifying guidelines. So qualifying a project isn't as straightforward. So I created steps that we could take that make sense. So step 1, of course, identify the project type and compare with the Art Commission's list of projects by looking on their website. I'll click on that in a second, but generally any projecting signs that are projecting over the right of way, you can basically guarantee the Art Commission approval is going to be required. They're going to want to review the design, the fonts, the colors to make sure it's like aesthetically pleasing and up to their standards. But you can always look on their website under their list of projects. So I'll click that real quick. So see, they do artwork approval, newsstand approval, which we're never going to do, construction approval, and then signs, awnings, or canopies, which is usually where we're going to be at right here. But like I said, if it's a projecting sign, then we're going to need Art Commission approval. But if it's a flat wall sign, or I'm sorry, like a window sign that's just kind of like a sticker, then they're not going to need to approve it. And then, of course, if you're unsure, reach out to the Art Commission to ask them if their approval will be required via our contacts or their general email here. And then something you can also do, if discussed with the client, is, hey, this might need Art Commission. We're not sure. We can't really get a clear answer from them. So what you can do is you can always just submit the application without Art Commission approval and wait for L&I to tell you if approval is required. And actually on the Art Commission's website, they tell you to do it like that because they don't have clear qualifying guidelines. So they leave it up to L&I to tell you. So it literally says that on their website. Apply to L&I and see if they tell you if you need our approval. So that could happen. You just have to use your, judgment. Any questions on Art Commission approval? Okay. And then we have the OPA, Office of Property Assessment approval, a lot more straightforward. The Office of Property Assessment determines property values and thus oversees property taxes. So when we're ever dealing with them, it's only because of lot line relocations for subdivisions or consolidations. And naturally, when a lot line is relocating, it's changing the lot size, which is changing the value of the property, which is thus changing the amount that the city is going to be taxing the property. And then a second thing that they oversee is all city approved legal addresses. So they're going to determine and distribute the new address for what's happening during a lot line relocation. So the only step to identify if the OPA involvement is required is if we're doing a lot line relocation project, then it's required. Pretty straightforward. Do you have any questions about OPA? And then Department of Records, they're not similar to OPA, but similar process for us. So the Department of Records is a really fun place to work that was created to ensure that Philly's municipal records are accurately tracked and maintained. We deal with the Department of Records when working with a lot line relocation for subdivision and consolidation projects. And then this is because the Department of Records is responsible for keeping records of all property deeds. And when going through a lot line relocation, the property deed is changing, which means we need to record a deed of subdivision or a deed of consolidation. Usually the attorney is doing this, but we should know what we're talking about because we're presenting the whole project strategy to the client. And then a deed, just a side note, is a legal document that transfers titles between owners, but it also outlines the entire description of land within the property and the structure within the property. So that's obviously changing, so a new deed is required. And then the steps to identify if the Department of Records involvement is required is simply if a lot line relocation project is being executed, then we need it. Any questions about that? All right, and we got Streets Department approval, which is always interesting and fun. But anyway, they manage a whole bunch of stuff within our city, such as trash, street closures, block parties, everything, a lot. They do a lot, all the craters and stuff like that. But when it comes to us, they oversee and approve all projects that project over the right-of-way. And the right-of-way is defined by like any area that is a public walkway, like a sidewalk. So if we're doing like a new construction project, the reason why the streets department has to approve every new construction project is because the sidewalk is here and the new construction is being built right up against the sidewalk, which means it's technically projecting over the right of way. And if you've ever seen houses that have like those bump outs with windows, those are projecting over the right of way. So the streets department has to approve if that's okay because it needs to be a certain height to make sure no one's head bumps it, all this crazy shit. So that's why they oversee new construction. And of course, for us, any projecting signs over the right of way, they have to stamp up on that. And then now that we're moving into equipment placement and the GCs are asking us for help with that, the streets department oversees dumpsters for construction, equipment placement for construction, street closures for construction, all that kind of stuff. And just when you're determining if streets department approval is needed, if it's a new construction project, it's going to be needed. If it's a projecting sign, it's going to be needed. And of course, if a client comes to us asking for equipment placement or dumpster permits or street closure permits, that's all streets department. So any questions about the streets department? And then the streets department, they have like what they call checklist 1 and checklist 2. And whenever we're like applying to the streets department, checklist 1 is like the lower impact development checklist for building and zoning permits. And then checklist 2 is for like very large development projects. So it's like a bigger checklist. And we submit that checklist, and then that's kind of the process. All right. So questions about any of the pre-approved